A couple of months back in April, Jordan Peterson responded to a tweet that Joe Biden sent out that said something about healthcare being a right, by himself saying, "Nothing that someone else has to provide can be a right." Now, this has annoyed me for so long, and I've been thinking about it for so long that, like an itch that I just couldn't help scratching, I've had to return to it. And so I decided to make this little video about that topic. It annoyed me in most part because this kind of simplistic, ideological, egocentric, Manichean, good, evil, there's this one-size-fits-all soundbite interpretation of political theory, of political rights. It wouldn't get past an undergraduate seminar without being torn apart. But I guess that's Twitter for you. So I thought it would be interesting today to unpack what this means. Nothing that someone else has to provide can be a right. So let's get stuck in. Jordan Peterson here is drawing on the distinction that's often made in political theory, political science, politics, between positive and negative rights. The idea of negative and positive freedoms was first talked about by Isaiah Berlin in 1958, I think it was, in his Two Concepts of Liberty. And the idea was expanded further in 1979 by the Czech theorist Karel Vasak, who talked not just about positive and negative freedoms, but positive and negative rights. In short, negative rights are the freedom from something, and positive rights are the freedom to something. They're entitlements. So negative rights are the freedom from interference, the freedom from oppression, from despotism, from kings, from someone standing in your way, from someone suppressing, repressing, oppressing you and your speech or your freedom of movement, say. And positive rights are the freedoms to something. They're freedoms to things like education and healthcare, a system of justice that you can rely on. And they're called positive because positive rights have to be provided by someone. They're entitlements because you can't have a freedom to education, say, without someone being obligated to teach you. Or that is at least the way conservatives and libertarians often frame it. But you'll notice that all rights, the right to something, have their opposites in duties that others have an obligation to uphold. So if I have the right not to be punched in the face, not to be attacked when I leave the house, then others have an obligation or a duty not to punch me in the face, not to attack me. So all rights, whether they're negative or positive, have this duality, this right and this duty, or this right or this liberty and this obligation. The difference, often said, is that negative rights mean that the duty on the other person's behalf is a duty not to do something. You just have to refrain from doing something. Whereas with positive rights, the entitlement on my behalf to something means that someone else doesn't just have to not do something. They have to provide something positively. They have to give something up in time, effort, resources. They have to be, apparently, according to libertarians and conservatives, forced to do something. This is why libertarians and conservatives often say, excuse me, that rights, as positive rights, are contradictory, because you can't have a negative right that's a freedom from something, but then in the same society have positive rights where a person is forced to provide healthcare or education, because that means the concept of rights will become contradictory because a person is being forced to do something against their so-called will. And this is why conservatives and libertarians often say that the individual is sovereign. The individual has to be able to choose for themselves. They can't be forced to do something. So negative rights fit in with this framework because you just have to restrain yourself from doing something. But positive rights, you can't be forced to do something against your will. The sovereign is apparently individual. Except this, I think, is where we find the first hole in the argument. This idea that the individual is sovereign and can and must and has to be left alone to choose for themselves, and that if you have a society in which positive rights exist, then this individual sovereign is forced to become a healthcare provider, is forced to become a teacher, because any right that someone has to provide for you cannot be a right. Now, the problem here is that, of course, we don't live in a society where I'm forced to become a teacher against my will. I'm forced into that line of work, into that type of career. I'm forced to be a doctor, or I'm forced to be a construction worker, putting up road signs and laying tarmac on roads. This is a positive right too. If we have a right to the freedom of movement, or the right to use roads and pavements, which another discussion maybe, then if that's a right, then someone else has to lay those roads. Of course, we're not forced to do any of these things. What we are expected to do is to provide financially for those things if and when we can. So it's not so much a matter of being forced into a certain choice, it's being asked to give back something to the community from which we've benefited in the first place when we can afford to. This is the first hole, this idea that the individual is sovereign above the community and doesn't have to provide anything for it and can only benefit from it. We know, any sensible person at least, that the individual is in a reciprocal, symbiotic relationship with the community that it lives in, that it's a part of it, that it takes some things from it and it gives back. We all do in some ways. We learn language from our upbringing, we give back by changing that language and speaking that language in unique ways. We're educated by the community, and then we go on to teach others later on. This all happens by osmosis, not necessarily purposefully, but this is how the world works. So in fact, I'd go even further here. I wouldn't say that libertarians are wrong, that there's no such thing as positive rights, that nothing that someone else has to provide can be a right. I'd go even further than saying this is wrong, and I'd say, in fact, there are no such thing as negative rights. There is no existing society in the world, contemporary or historical, in which people are just left to their own devices to have these magical negative rights, where they're free to do anything, go anywhere, say what they want, acquire all the property that they want. In fact, when we look at how rights developed historically, which is really the most scientific way to explore and talk about these topics, when we look at how rights developed historically, what we see instead is that these things that we call negative freedoms were actually deliberated over, fought for, historically, culturally, socially, produced and constructed and put into law. So you can't have the negative right to be free from attack on the streets without that being a law, without that being protected by the police, without there being a system of a free and fair trial and juries, without there being a social expectation that you don't do that. In other words, we all live in this society where the negative rights that we enjoy, the negative rights that we all benefit from, they are provided by someone too. They're provided by this system of law, the system of precedent and juries, the system of a police force. In other words, the individual, the sovereign individual, is created by society. You're born into this society that we all give to, that we nurture, and a free individual with certain perspectives on the world, with certain possibilities and the freedom to choose, with a good education, with a certain level of healthcare, arises out of this. So all rights are provided by the community. All rights confer obligations upon others. So by this logic that nothing else someone else has to provide is a right, we'd have no right to education, no right to healthcare, but no right to safe roads and signage. We'd have no right to decent electricity and gas. We'd have no right to free and fair elections. We'd have no right to a fair trial. I mean, think about elections and trials. All these things have to be provided by someone. This, I'm sure Jordan Peterson would agree, is a good thing. We should have a system where someone protects and supports free and fair elections. You have to have monitors and a national system set up where people can go and vote, and it has to be done safely and effectively and non-fraudulently. The same with free and fair election. The same with a fair trial. Has to be provided by someone. There has to be lawyers. There has to be a building you go to. There has to be a whole system set up that's protected. So, yeah, this idea that nothing that someone else has to provide can be a right is clearly self-contradictory. It's clearly absolute nonsense. And I think what's really going on when conservatives and libertarians talk about this idea of no such thing as positive rights, and that they just want to be sovereign individuals, is that they just don't want to be told what to do by anyone. It's a type of naive, childish worldview. It's a type of arrogance where they think they can stand beyond and above the community. They think they're above it. And it interests me that the metaphor that they have to reach for is the metaphor of the sovereign, of the king. They think they can be kings of the world, I think. They think that they can be in control of their own choices in their own domain, and they don't have to give and take with others and make compromises. But I think, like kings, when you look at why and how they use this metaphor, they often talk about freedom, but when you look at their beliefs in other areas, freedom doesn't come into the picture as much as you'd assume. Those that bemoan the sovereignty of the individual very quickly seem to become authoritarians in other areas. They almost always want to tell women what they can and can't do with their bodies, what gender expressions and sexual proclivities and rights to abortions are appropriate or inappropriate. They almost always seem to think that this freedom only extends to the border and only within their own country and not to immigration or immigrants. The freedom almost never extends to the abolition of military interventionism, foreign adventurism. They almost always seem to support or not be too concerned with the freedom from police brutality or the freedom to organise in your workplace, the freedom to join a union. Their view of freedom, in short, seems to be, I've made a little bit of money now and I just want to be left alone with it. So these sovereign individuals, these kings, they always claim to want freedom for everyone, but what kings really usually want is power for themselves. And I think what they'd find out once they became kings is that kings often quickly discover that they also have obligations and duties to their countries, to the power structure that holds them up, that being a king is not so freeing as they first thought. I think once these individual, sovereign, loving conservatives become kings, they wouldn't quite be as happy with being king as they first thought. Then again, maybe they would.